You probably saw the headlines. The beloved mayor of a major American city, handcuffed in his $5,000 suit on live television, in the middle of his own re-election debate, while federal agents walked calmly onto the stage and the cameras kept rolling, because no one had the presence of mind to cut the feed. The media called it a stunning FBI operation, a victory for justice, a shock to the political establishment. But they don't know the real story. I do, because I'm the wife he abandoned. And I'm the one who handed them the handcuffs. Welcome back to Secret Confessions, True Stories. If you love stories of absolute accountability and the kind of justice that arrives precisely on time, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one, and you do not want to miss them. Now let me tell you exactly how my husband built his own prison, and how I supplied the blueprints. I spent 25 years building a political career that was not mine. I want to start there, with that clarity, because I think it matters to understand what 25 years of invisible labor looks like before you can understand what I was willing to do once it was over. My name is irrelevant to this story. What's relevant is what I was. I am a forensic accountant. I have been a forensic accountant since my late 20s, trained to find the things that people hide in numbers, to read financial documents the way other people read novels, for plot, for character, for the moments where the story stops making sense and something else begins. It is not a glamorous skill. It does not make you the center of attention at dinner parties. But it is, as it turned out, an extraordinarily useful one to possess when the person you trusted for 25 years turns out to have been hiding something very large for a very long time. When I met Daniel, he was a city council candidate with charisma, ambition, and absolutely no ability to organize his own finances. This is not a criticism. It is simply a description. He was brilliant at the things that make a politician: the speech, the room, the handshake, the particular quality of attention that makes each constituent feel uniquely seen and valued. He was terrible at the accounting. He didn't know what he was spending, didn't know where the money was coming from in sufficient detail, and had the approximate relationship with a spreadsheet of someone who considers them a hostile artifact of another civilization. I ran his books. From the first campaign, I was the one who knew where every dollar of contribution money went, every expenditure, every compliance deadline, every filing that needed to happen for the campaign to remain legal and functional. I did this because I was good at it, and because I loved him, and because it was, genuinely, the right division of labor given who each of us was. He went to the events and gave the speeches and shook the hands. I sat in the back offices and made sure the money was accounted for. 25 years of this. City council to city commissioner to deputy mayor to mayor, 2 terms. The second won by a margin that the campaign consultants called historic. I was at every victory party. I stood beside him at every press conference in the early years, and slightly behind him in the later ones, once the image consultants arrived and began shaping the brand. I was the invisible architecture of everything visible about him, and I had made my peace with that arrangement because I believed in the work and I believed in him. The change came after the second election. I want to be precise about this because I think the timeline matters. It was not a gradual shift. It was the specific, sudden reorientation of someone who has arrived somewhere they have been working toward and has decided that the person who helped them get there is no longer part of the picture they want. He became cruel in the way of someone who has learned that cruelty carries no consequences when you have enough power. Not violent, nothing that direct. The cruelty of dismissal, of someone who talks over you in meetings they would not have been in without you, who corrects you in front of staff about things you understand better than they do, who introduces you at events with the careful positioning of someone managing an obligation rather than presenting a partner. Small cruelties, which are in some ways the hardest kind, because there is no single moment large enough to point to. And then there was one large moment. He came to me on a Sunday evening and told me, with the composed delivery of someone who has been coached on how to deliver a difficult message, that he wanted a divorce. He had, he said, developed a relationship with someone who was more aligned with where his life was going. Her name was Brittany. She was 25 years old and worked as a political lobbyist, a profession that meant she understood his world, which I understood to mean she found him impressive in a way that he needed at this stage of his life, and that I, having watched the whole construction of his impressiveness from the foundation, was no longer capable of providing. He also said that I had become a liability to his new image. I want to make sure you hear that correctly. A liability. 25 years of building the image, and I had become a liability to it. What he did next is the part that moved this from a painful personal situation to something else. He used his political connections, which were considerable, to freeze our joint accounts while the divorce proceedings were being initiated. He had conversations with his lawyers and with certain financial institutions that resulted in a situation where money I had helped accumulate was temporarily inaccessible to me. He told me he expected me to vacate the home we had shared for 20 years. He told mutual friends and some of his donors that he intended to ensure I came away from this marriage with the minimum legally required, that his team was very good and mine would find the process difficult. He said these things about the woman who had managed his books for 25 years. He appeared to have forgotten, in the intoxication of the second-term victory, and the new relationship, and the certainty that his connections made him invulnerable, that I knew exactly where every dollar he had ever touched had come from, and where it had gone. That was his error. That was the error. I did not call a divorce attorney first. I am aware that many people in my position would have, and I understand why. But I am a forensic accountant, and before I was his wife, I was a person who follows money for a living, and something in the way he had moved to freeze the accounts, the speed of it, the specific mechanisms used, the particular financial institutions involved, told me that he had been planning something for longer than the divorce conversation suggested. I went to the basement. We had a home office in the basement, which had been my workspace for the campaign finance work I had been doing informally alongside my professional practice for years. I had access to everything down there: hard drives, ledgers, the complete financial documentation of 25 years of political operation. It took me approximately 4 days to understand that what I was looking at was considerably larger than hidden marital assets. Let me tell you what I found, because I want to be specific. Because the specificity is what makes this real rather than abstract. The city's elderly pension fund had, over a period of approximately 3 years, experienced what the official reports categorized as a series of investment underperformances. This is the kind of language that appears in quarterly reports, and that most people, including most of the people responsible for oversight of the fund, accept at face value, because the explanation sounds technical, and the people providing it are authoritative. I am not most people. I read the investment underperformance documentation, and I read the underlying transaction records that should have been generating the returns that were instead not materializing. And what I found was that the money had not underperformed. It had moved. Specifically, it had moved through a series of intermediary accounts, structured with the particular care of someone who knew exactly what would and would not trigger automatic regulatory attention, into offshore accounts in jurisdictions I recognized from professional experience as places where questions are not welcomed. The amount, across 3 years of systematic transfers, was just over $4 million. The destination, as I was able to determine through the kind of patient documentary reconstruction that is the core skill of my profession, was a combination of accounts that ultimately funded the purchase of a property in Aspen, Colorado, and associated expenses that I will describe simply as consistent with establishing a second life of considerable comfort. Brittany's name appeared on the property title. I sat in the basement with this information for the better part of a week. I want to describe what that week felt like because I think it is important. It was not, primarily, grief. The grief had happened earlier. What I felt, sitting with those documents, was a very specific quality of cold clarity that I had experienced before in my professional life. The feeling that arrives when you have followed a trail of numbers to its conclusion and understood, completely, what the numbers mean. It is not satisfaction exactly. It is more like the completion of a proof. The thing you suspected is confirmed, and now you know exactly what you are working with. I also made a practical decision during that week, which was that what I had found was not primarily a marital matter. $4 million from a pension fund established for the retirement security of city employees, people who had worked their entire careers in public service, on the understanding that the money being held for them would be there when they needed it, was not something that should be resolved in a divorce proceeding. It was something else entirely. I had a friend at the IRS with whom I had worked on a professional matter some years earlier. She was thorough, she was discreet, and she had the institutional authority to ensure that what I brought her would be handled through proper channels and not quietly managed away by anyone with political influence over the local level of investigation. I called her. I sent her the documentation I had compiled, organized in the format that anyone who reviews financial crime documentation for a living would find immediately legible. I told her I would be available for follow-up questions. And then I waited. This is the part that people find surprising when I tell them, the patience of it. But I am a forensic accountant. I follow money for a living. I understand that the work that matters is done in the documentation phase, and that what follows is largely process. I had done the work. I waited for the process. The re-election debate was scheduled for a Tuesday evening, 8 weeks after my initial conversation with my contact. I had received, in the days preceding the debate, a quiet indication that the federal investigation had progressed to a point where an enforcement action was imminent. I was not told the specific timeline. I was not involved in operational decisions. But I understood, from 25 years of being in rooms where information was handled carefully, what imminent meant in the context of a live televised event. I bought a ticket to the debate, front row, VIP section, which required a political donor status I had accumulated over the same 25 years of work that Daniel was now describing me as a liability. I wore something understated, and I sat in the seat and I watched the pre-event preparation with the attention of someone who is prepared for a great many events of exactly this kind and knows what the various stages of setup look like. Daniel walked onto the stage with the particular bearing of someone who has convinced himself, over the course of a very successful career, that he is the protagonist of every room he enters. He was polished in the way of someone who has been managed and coached and media trained to within an inch of his natural self. He looked, to everyone in that auditorium and to the cameras and to the viewers at home, like exactly what he had spent 25 years presenting himself as: a competent, experienced, trustworthy public servant. His opponent was a younger man whose strength was his credibility on fiscal accountability issues. The irony of this was not lost on me. The debate proceeded through its standard segments: opening statements, policy questions. The particular theater of two candidates attempting to demonstrate character while simultaneously undermining the others. Daniel was good at this. He had always been good at this. He spoke about the city's elderly population with the specific warmth of someone who genuinely believes in the thing they are saying, while simultaneously stealing millions from the fund intended to support those same people. The Q&A segment came after the first hour. This is the portion of a debate where selected audience members may ask questions directly of the candidates. I had submitted a question in advance through the registration process, which had been accepted in the lottery with the kind of bureaucratic neutrality that does not distinguish between the intentions of different askers. When my number was called, I stood. I am aware of what I looked like in that moment: a woman in her 50s in a conservative blazer, in the front row of a political debate, standing to ask a question. I am aware that nothing about my appearance communicated what was about to happen. This was intentional. The moderator acknowledged me, and I was handed a microphone. Daniel saw me when I stood. I watched his face in the moment of recognition, and I will tell you that what moved across it was not guilt or fear, but something more controlled: the managed suppression of surprise, the quick internal calculation of someone assessing a variable they had not planned for. He leaned slightly toward his microphone and said something to the security team in the wings that I could see but not hear. The security personnel began moving toward me. I did not wait for them to arrive. I said, clearly and at a volume calibrated for the room and the cameras, I have a question for the mayor about the city's elderly pension fund. Specifically, I would like to ask about the transfers totaling $4,312,000 that were moved from that fund through accounts at two named institutions, and I named them specifically by their full institutional names, into offshore accounts in jurisdictions that I also named specifically, before being used to fund the purchase of a property in Aspen, Colorado, currently registered in the name of Brittany. And then I read the account numbers, all of them, from memory, because I had spent enough time with those documents that the numbers were as familiar to me as my own phone number, and because I had understood that the most powerful thing I could do in this moment was to be completely precise, to offer nothing that could be dismissed as approximation or allegation, to give only the kind of specific numerical information that either is accurate or is not, and that everyone watching would understand could not have been invented. The room was the kind of quiet that happens when a large number of people simultaneously understand that something irreversible has just occurred. Daniel's composed expression, the product of 25 years of political seasoning, held for approximately 3 seconds after I finished speaking. 3 seconds is actually quite long under those circumstances. And then it did not hold. He began speaking toward his microphone. I did not hear what he said because the room was beginning to be something other than quiet. The specific, controlled chaos of an auditorium full of people and cameras, all responding simultaneously to something unexpected. The security personnel reached me, and I handed the microphone to the nearest one, with the cooperative calm of someone who has said everything they came to say. The federal agents entered through the side doors approximately 4 minutes later. There were 6 of them. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people doing something they have prepared carefully for, which they had, and they went directly to the stage, and they did what they had come to do. He was handcuffed in his $5,000 suit while the cameras ran and the room erupted, and Brittany, who had been in the VIP section on the opposite side of the auditorium, left through the nearest exit at a speed inconsistent with someone who had expected the evening to go this way. I sat back down in my front row seat and watched. The aftermath moved quickly, as these things do when the documentation is comprehensive, and the evidence has been assembled by someone who understands what makes a federal case. The charges were substantial: federal fraud, embezzlement of public funds, money laundering. And the evidentiary record that my documentation had contributed to was, by the account of the prosecutors, among the most thorough pre-investigation preparation they had encountered. He was convicted. The sentence was 10 years in federal prison, which at his age and with his health conditions is a very long time. He would lose his pension, his position, his reputation, and the particular freedom of someone who has always believed that the people around him would manage the consequences of his choices. The Aspen property was seized. The recovery of the pension fund money was not complete. Some of the offshore transfers had been moved in ways that required international legal process to address. But substantial recovery occurred, and the city employees whose retirement security had been jeopardized received communication that the fund was being restored. I was asked to consult on the recovery process. This led to a formal appointment to a city task force on financial oversight of public funds, which led to the kind of professional profile that generates its own momentum. The forensic accounting practice I established in the year following the trial has grown beyond what I projected, partly because I am good at what I do, and partly because the particular visibility of what had happened meant that people understood, specifically and concretely, what competent forensic accounting can accomplish. I want to say something before I leave you with this story, about the particular kind of miscalculation that made everything I've described possible. Men who accumulate power in the way Daniel accumulated it, through the labor of someone else who receives less credit than they contribute, tend to make a specific error about the person who has been doing that labor. They mistake invisibility for insubstantiality. They assume that because the accountant is not in the photograph, she does not know what the photograph is built on. They forget, in the intoxication of the position they have reached, that the position was built by someone who understood its foundation better than they did. Daniel knew that I was intelligent. He had known that for 25 years. What he failed to account for was what 25 years of being intelligent in a supporting role, while watching someone else take the credit, does to a person's attention to detail. It makes it very precise. It makes it very patient. It makes it the kind of precise and patient that can reconstruct $4 million of hidden transactions from documentation that the people who moved the money believed was sufficiently obscured. He called me a liability to his new image. He said it to my face, and he said it to his donors, and he said it to the people around him who understood it as the kind of thing powerful men say when they are done with the women who helped make them powerful. What he should have said, the more accurate assessment, had he been capable of making it, was that I was the most qualified person in the world to find exactly what he had done, and that making me his adversary was the most consequential error of his political career. He was right that I was a liability. He was just wrong about which direction the liability ran. The quiet women keeping the books always know where the bodies are buried. The mistake is assuming they will stay quiet about it. Thank you for being here today. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. I read every one. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next confession.